Hello, friends, and welcome to Colliding Worldviews. And I'm so glad for you to be here with me today because we, as you can see, are starting off a brand new season of Colliding Worldviews. And a whole lot of great guests are scheduled in the weeks to come, or the months to come, I should say, and a whole lot of informative topics to get you better equipped and educated about different worldviews throughout the world and how we can engage those worldviews and, of course, get the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ out to people, regardless of whatever worldview they currently happen to hold. Now, today, it is my honor to have one of my great mentors on the show today as my guest, and this is none other than Dr. Daniel Janosic. He has been on in the past, and I had him on in the past, of course, on a number of shows, but we did a Colliding Worldviews episode about his first book that he wrote, which is called John of Damascus, First Apologist to the Muslims, the Trinity and Christian Apologetics in the Early Islamic Period. This is definitely a book that you want to get. This is his first book. But the reason I have him on here today is to talk about his brand new book that just came out less than a month ago. And this is called The Guide to Answering Islam, What Every Christian Needs to Know About Islam and the Rise of Radical Islam. Again, by Dr. Daniel Janosic. If you're not sure who he is, let me go ahead and just read a little bit of his bio on the back here. It says Dr. Daniel Janosic is the Director of Islamic Studies, Adjunct Professor of Apologetics, Historical Theology, and Islamic Studies at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and the Adjunct Professor in Apologetics at CIU, which is Columbia International University. And he did his dissertation again on John of Damascus, the first apologist to the Muslims. And that was his first book. But again, this is the book that we're talking about today. And I love the there. This needs to be underlined because this is definitely the guide that you need to get. Very, very well-balanced book on exposing the history of Islam, exposing the history of Muhammad, giving all the different critiques from different professors and different viewpoints of the actual evidence that we have, at the same time encouraging Christians to get out there and share the gospel with Muslims, because guess what? They are people made in the image of God. There's a whole lot of people out there who just demonize Islam and Muslims. We say no. Critique Islam, but at the same time love Muslims because they're people who need the gospel. Dr. Janosic, it's great to have you back on Colliding Worldviews.
Tony, it's great to be back. Thank you for your great introduction. I have appreciated you as a student and much more so as a host. You do a great job, and I look forward to going over some of the things in this book and explaining why I feel that it is the book that every Christian needs to have in order to understand Islam so that we can reach out as Christians with truth and love, as you have said.
And there are a whole lot of books out there on Islam. You and I both have a lot of books. There's a lot of good books, a lot of great material that different people have compiled for us. Very helpful. I mean, we're blessed to have all these different sources on Islam written by Christians, and of course, to have access to Islamic sources today more than ever before. But out of all the different books that we have, what was the reason why you wrote this book? What makes this book different from all the other great ones that are out there already?
Well, there are a number of reasons, but the primary reason is that there is not a book that really explains the four areas that I cover all together. And as you said, I tried to balance these with truth and love. Truth being what really happened. Love is our attitude as Christians to reach out to those who do not know Christ. And so with the first part, I try to capture in every single chapter a bona fide, accurate view of what the Muslims believe from their own sources. So you can look up those sources and ask Muslims, is this what you believe? And hopefully they will say yes, because I have asked them for years if this is what they believe. And then the second thing is that I try to deal with critiquing that from an historical, archaeological, linguistic, theological viewpoint. What is really happening in what they are saying? Did it really happen? What are their theological views? How do they compare? What is our critique from a Christian perspective? And then the third thing would be the implications. What does this mean for us? What does it mean for Islam, Christianity, the world today? How do we assess this? Where do we take this? So the implications. But then the fourth part, and this is in every chapter, and then a special chapter at the end, is the part about the bridge, reaching out to Muslims with this material that you've just read and asking yourself, how can I take this material and use it to speak to my Muslim friend about Christ, about the gospel, about what Muslims believe, and why we as Christians believe what we do, hoping to bridge the gap and bring them home to Jesus Christ.
And those few things are just one of the things that make this book unique, again, compared to all the other great books that are out there that are give us a whole lot of content and history about Islam and the life of Muhammad. But just to have those study questions, Dr. Janosik, as you intended, and I want to let people know that this is a great book to take your Sunday school class through, because guess what? After you read the chapters and they give you all of the great information, you do have those implications of, okay, how does this impact the worldview of Islam? And of course, in contrast to that, the Judeo-Christian worldview, and about the apologetic conclusions. And of course, in those apologetic conclusion areas of the chapters, they are polemical as well. They're also critiquing Islam at the same time, giving the defense of Christianity in contrast to that. And again, the study questions are great because any small group or Sunday school class can use this book and just do one chapter a week or however they like to do it. And of course, at the end of the day, those building bridges to understand and encouraging Christians that even though you just got in this chapter a whole lot of information that is destructive to the Islamic worldview and may offend particular Muslims out there, these are tips that Dr. Janosik gives you to have this information in the back of your mind, but at the same time, bring it up when necessary. You know, if you're talking with a Muslim and you don't need to do any polemics, you don't need to critique Islam, and maybe you don't even need to defend Christianity, then the gospel is really what they need. The gospel is our goal, and every apologetic or polemic should lead to the cross and pointing people to who Jesus Christ truly is. Now, another reason we need to get this book, Dr. Janosik, this is one of the things I loved, is you bring back the greatness of footnotes, because it's really convenient to be reading a page and just look down and see that reference rather than have to have an extra bookmark at the end of the book for endnotes. So anyway, I love the footnote just aspect of it alone. But we want to get through, if we can, in this episode and in a second episode, we want to give the audience a short summary of the 18 chapters that are in this book, and just a little a teaser or snippet of what you can expect more of. Again, I highly encourage you to get the book. You can get it on Amazon.com right now. You can get the Kindle version as well. And in the first chapter, you talk about the pre-Islamic overview, paganism or heretical monotheism. What would you like to share with our audience about the reason for that first chapter?
Okay. Well, first I'd like to point back to some of the things that you said in regard to the purpose of the book. I did write it for the layperson in the church to really understand Islam better. And so it is ideal for the Sunday school scenario, and the questions are great. And I'm also going to be putting together some videos that will be utilized in that capacity. But when we look at this first section, it's an historical section. The first 6 chapters deal with historical events or supposed historical events. And this first chapter is pre-Islam. What did Arabia look like before Muhammad came on the scene? Well, Muslims say that it was in a state of ignorance, a state of disarray, a state of atheism, and all kinds of problems. They called it Jahiliyyah. And one of the reasons that they like to mention this is that they feel that Muhammad came in, and through the religion of Islam that was revealed to him, there came an order to the Arab world. So it was able to come together as a force and within 100 years take over the Middle East, over almost one half of the former Christian lands because of this power. So the idea of Islam is that this was a time of ignorance that Muhammad corrected. However, when we look at the archaeological and the actual historical writings from that time, we find that it was a hotbed of all kinds of religious viewpoints. And there were many people who believed in one God, a monotheistic religion of one sort or another, Judaism, Christianity, and in between. And there seemed to be this growing religion that was an intermediate monotheism. It was not Judaism, it was not Christianity, but it had a blending of the two. And this is the essential trail that we were trying to figure out as I went through the book in these first historical chapters. What really was happening at that time? And we find out it's very different from the Muslim story, and it'll unfold as we go through some of the other chapters.
And I think that is a very impactful chapter, because not only do you go in depth on just, obviously, if Christianity is true, which we have all the evidence in the world to prove that it is, there has to be an alternative explanation to every worldview out there, which actually claims to be reality, although we have no evidence that it is. So if Muhammad was not the last prophet, then what's the explanation of how that came together? How did the Quran come together? You have these differing views that Arabs were just waiting for a prophet to come, and at the same time other scholars who are saying, well, no, like you said, there's a lot of different heresy and stuff going on. Very interesting historical information in that chapter, and the intermediate monotheism is very interesting too, because as you mentioned in there, it was kind of like a Judeo-Christian heretical cult type of view that Muhammad emerged from. And of course, this is just one of the theories or evidence-based alternate explanations of how Islam came about. And of course, your first book, John of Damascus, is a great book for people to get more about him. But it's interesting because I was reading in this book that an Nestorian monk told Muhammad that he was chosen by God to be a prophet because of an unusual mole on Muhammad's back. And I hadn't heard that before, but I did know that John of Damascus said that Muhammad learned about Jesus from an Arian monk. So if he has a Nestorian monk telling him that he's a prophet, and he learns about who Jesus is from an Arian monk, no surprise that Muhammad had an out-of-whack, inaccurate view of who Jesus was. And at the same time, you tie in a heretical view of Jesus with the explanation of how even Muhammad as a historical figure came about, being mentioned 4 times in the Quran, and how it could have been a Messiah figure who people were waiting for based on the Old Testament. But as the New Testament claims that he's the Son of God, they didn't believe that. So very interesting explanation of this intermediate monotheism that was going on at that time. And of course, the heretical views that had already been dealt with by the church councils, those views were still out there, even though the Orthodox Christianity was just being strengthened more by taking care of these heresies that were spreading. But in the second chapter, you talk about Muhammad, final prophet or apocalyptic preacher. How do you tie that into what the explanation that I had just given there?
Okay. Well, what we find with Muhammad is that we really don't know much about him. In fact, the name Muhammad was not mentioned by Muslims until about 70 years later, when Abdul Malik had the Dome of the Rock built, and then the name was etched there. Though it could mean chosen one. It could actually be a reference to Jesus Christ, the Muhammad as a title, the chosen one. But there was most likely a physical person who had these ideas, that spoke these ideas, and that they were eventually written down in what we know as the Quran. And I give a lot of historical background for the various viewpoints in regard to Muhammad. But as far as a person, there are a lot of questions that we need to explore. And this chapter does that. For example, Muhammad may have come not from the area of Mecca down in the southern part of Arabia, but it seems more likely that he came from an area up near Israel, 600 miles north of Mecca, from an area called Petra, a city called Petra. We're going to talk more about that in the fourth chapter, but it seems like Mecca was not on the map at that time. And what it was, if there was anything there, archaeology shows that we have no record from before the ninth century. Maps do not show Mecca until the 10th century. Um, and yet it came into a prominence about 70, 80 years later, again during the time of Abd al-Malik, when all these things were um, also coming together. It seemed like Abd al-Malik needed a prophet, and that was Muhammad, a book, and that was the Quran, and a religion, and that became Islam. And as we said, the religion could have come from an amalgamation of Judaistic thought and Christian thought, as well as Zoroastrian and other religions, because we see these traces all through the Quran. And that's what we're getting into with the third chapter, and that's on the Quran. How did that come about? We're finding that there are early manuscripts, but the earliest manuscripts really seem to spread from around the early 700s, and that's another 60, 70 years after the supposed death of Muhammad in 632 AD. Here we're talking about 700, also in the time of Muhammad. But we find that there are a lot of different manuscripts. See, the Muslims say that the Quran was perfect from the beginning. It was revealed to Muhammad. He started getting these revelations when he was 40 years old. He was in a cave. And then through the next 23 years, he had these revelations, which were finally written down 20 years after his birth, after his death, according to the Muslim traditional view. But we find that by the early 700s, they're very different. They have corrections, they have erasures, they have tapeovers, they have a lot of information that seems to show that there was a concerted effort to bring these manuscripts together. And the big question mark is why? Who is behind this? What was happening? But we begin to realize that the Quran was not a perfect book written at one time, and that it has a lot of stories from other religions, Jewish traditions, Christian traditions, Greek traditions, and uses a lot of words from other languages, especially Syriac, which would make sense if a lot of this happened up in the area of Petra, because that's near Syria. Syria was the general religious language. It's an Aramaic language. And so there are a lot of things going on that do not follow along with the traditional Muslim stories. And that's what I try to point out. I give the traditional story, and I show how history and archaeology and theology differ from these particular stories. And we need to understand that, and we need to trace through to see what is really going on.
And it was interesting too, even when you bring up the Quran and how that came about. The traditional story is bad enough. The traditional story is that Uthman burned the variants. So the Quran, if even according to the traditional story, was a very tightly controlled text right from the beginning. Because guess what? All of the variants were burned and destroyed, whereas the Bible was not a controlled text from the beginning. It was spread, copied over and over and over again. And it wasn't later until the canon time that it was starting to come a little bit more under control of, okay, which books or which epistles, etc., are actually the Word of God. What needs to actually be put in here? So the nature of how it came about, much different than the Bible in and of itself, just because of that. But how about just the origin of Islam in general? We touched on it there for a moment. talking about Petra, which of course we find archaeological evidence for that. When we compare the works of, say, Dan Gibson to what the Quran says archaeological wise. But what about this new path to God, or a Jewish Christian heresy that you talk about in chapter 4?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned Dan Gibson, and he did a book on Quranic geography where he showed that for the first 100 years, the Qibla, or the direction of prayer in the mosque that were built in this early 100 years, all pointed to Petra. That's 600 miles north of Mecca, present-day Mecca, closer to Jerusalem. And it shows that there was a different scheme going on, a different understanding of this religion, or what was becoming the religion of Islam. So Dan Gibson shows that Mecca was not the central place, and instead Petra could have been that central place. Well, what else was happening in Petra? You have 9 place names that are mentioned in the Quran. Most of those place names originate there in the area of Nabatea, which is the Nabatean kingdom, which included Petra as its center. So it seems like a lot more was going on in Petra than in Mecca. In fact, the descriptions in the Quran, the olive trees that are mentioned, the types of herds, the type of trade, and so on, fits Petra much better than it would Mecca, which was in a dry, barren wasteland. Petra had streams flowing through, and it was the center of their kingdom for several hundred years before the earthquakes of the 6th century, which plays into later scenarios as to why Mecca was chosen for a pilgrimage spot, but after the time of Abd al-Malik, after the time of 700. So we have a lot going on there, but it seems like the origination of Islam really moves up 600 miles and centers in Petra, and that's why the Umayyad Empire, which centered itself in Damascus, Syria, probably chose that spot rather than Mecca. There's a lot that we are not told, and that does come out in this book, that you need to understand in order to realize that there is a lot more going on between Christianity and Judaism and heresy than often is spoken of. And so these things come out in the book in the historical background.
And it's great to educate people about that, again, giving them this alternate explanation of how Islam came about, along with the apologetic answers of backing up the Bible and the Christian worldview, and how we can build a bridge, not saying that, oh, look how much Islam and Christianity have in common, but building a bridge and actually getting the gospel to Muslims and helping to make that make sense. Now, chapter 5, you talk about theological development of Islam, the opening of the gates of heaven, or the closing of the Muslim mind. And this is something that a lot of people are not aware of. A lot of people have heard about the Sunni-Shia split, or this war that was going on between particular Muslims, much closer, of course, to the death of Muhammad. A lot of people, though, don't know about the second big battle between Muslims that was going on about 1,000 years ago. And this was more of an intellectual battle, which is very, very interesting. Of course, too, when you study that and you realize which side of that theological or philosophical battle actually won, and how that has shaped the Muslim mind, or perhaps closed the Muslim mind. So, Dr. Janasik, please inform our audience about that chapter.
Okay, in brief, because you could go into this in great detail. In brief, around 150 years during the Abbasid period, which started at 750, 100 years after Muhammad's death, and that's centered in Baghdad, and that's centered with the Iranian or the Persian mindset to a great degree. And there is a lot more philosophical thought at that time as to what they believed through Islam. And there were 3 debates that were going on. The first debate was dealing with works versus faith, which was more important. The second debate was dealing with predestination versus man's free will. And that was a really interesting one. Predestination won out, and that's what pretty much rules the theological spectrum of Islam today. The third one has not really quieted down, and that has to do with the Quran, whether the Quran is eternal in itself or it was something that was created and sent down as a created thing. Um, and so those conundrums were carried out by the different groups, the middle group, the Asherites, the more rational group called the Mutazilites. And for a time, the Mutazilites won out, and then they were defeated, and the Asherites won out. And one of those famous Asherites was a man named Al-Ghazali, and he is known as one of their chief philosophers. And this is in the early 12th century, late 11th century, early 12th century, when Al-Ghazali lived, at the time of Thomas Aquinas. So they were similar in their philosophical scope to some extent. But Al-Ghazali came to the point, he was an Asherite and he was for balance, but he came to a point where he was saying that, well, all you need really is the revelation. He had something against philosophy at that time, and there were some other philosophers that he argued with, and he finally said, you know, philosophy is man-made, it's man's ideas, and it leads us astray. What we need is just the word of Allah, and so the Quran is all we need. Get rid of all the other books. And from Al-Ghazali on, there's been a closing in the Muslim mind. There's been a sense where Muslims are not are told not to ask questions, but just to accept the ideas that were handed down from the past. And so there is that closing in the Muslim mind. And one book that I really recommend in regard to that is a book by Robert Riley, and
Great one.
The Closing of the Muslim Mind. And he does an excellent job of going over this theology and the final conclusion that Al-Ghazali brings to the whole idea.
And Al-Ghazali and his philosophy and his personal viewpoint on those three things that you mentioned are what won out, that there is no free will, that the Quran is eternal, and the third one, what's the
Faith
third one?
And reason.
That
faith wins out over reason. Or
right.
Faith versus works.
Reason, throw that out the window. You don't need to be logical. It's just all about tradition and what those before us believed, and we need to continue that on. We have just a couple minutes left in this episode, but let's give a quick summary of Chapter 6. I know we definitely need a lot more than 2 minutes, but that's why I want to encourage people to get the book. This is Islamic Golden Age and Expansion, Path of Peace or Trail of Blood, Chapter 6.
Oh, we could speak a whole hour on this, but the basic idea here is that we have this idea or these views coming from Muslims saying that when Islam took over the Christian lands and the Jewish lands, that there was a type of peace, camaraderie, or a stable community that was built, and they pick out Spain, or what was called Al-Andalus at that time. And yet, what we find out is that this was not true at all. That in the time that they invaded Spain, and why did they invade Spain? I mean, that was not their land. They invaded Europe, and all through the Middle Ages, from 700s on, they kept pressing up against the borders of Europe, and they kept raiding along the coast, and they kept on taking slaves from North Africa and from Europe itself. Well over 1 million slaves from Europe, well over 20 million from Africa. But in Spain and Al-Andalus, there was a sense that there was a type of society that welcomed and allowed the Jews and the Christians to do okay, to thrive, but they didn't. In fact, there is a great book that was written by um, Dario Fernandez Morera, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. And he goes
Hmm.
through all of that information and shows that this was not a very welcome place for Jews and Christians, but that they were held under the thumb of the Muslims, and they were still held to the three conditions, the three choices that were given to many non-Muslims: convert, die, or pay the jizya, pay the head tax, the money that you would have to save your head for that year. And that's what happened in Al Andalus. So there was an expansion, but it was an expansion that was uh, interesting in the sense that here we have a nation that conquered in the first 100 years almost one half of the Christian world, and we don't say, well, that was wrongful colonialism. They need to give that land back
Hmm.
to the Christians. We don't hear
Yeah.
that. And then they went into Spain, North Africa, and they kept on trying to come in to Europe from the other end. And so there was a lot of fighting going on at that time. And we need to understand why that was going on, what were the results. And this chapter explores that in much more detail.
And a very important chapter indeed. And that's actually all we have time for in this particular episode. But I do want to encourage people to check out the next episode. We're going to continue on and give a summary of the rest of Dr. Janostik's great second book that just got released. So we'll see you next time on Colliding Worldviews.